welcome to Old Path and our study through the Old Testament book of Psalms. We're going to be in Psalm 74 and we'll get through 76 today. And before we actually start the study, what I'd like to do is answer what would be kind of an obvious question if we're studying through this. We're going to see the Psalms. This is actually a section where the Psalms are attributed to Asaph. And the person Asaph, we know him from David's times. What's described here in this first of the Psalms that we're going to study today clearly was nothing like this happened during David's times. So just to answer the question, just in case you're curious and would like to go look it up, I'll give you the references to it. We'll look up here in just a moment. But as far as it's concerned, there are the down the line, if you will, family members that would be mentioned as really kind of, they might be referred to as the single person, but they're just kind of the descendants thereof. In this case, we see it's attributed to Asaph, but it is really going to be something that would have been written, or in this case, if it's even a guild, some would say that you don't have to be a direct descendant of Asaph, but rather of the poets and the musicians that would be of his grouping that could be attributed to him. I have no reason to think it's anything otherwise than it is his descendants that are being spoken of here as Asaph, because clearly Asaph wouldn't have been around when this took place. So with all of that said, if you want to go ahead and look them up, rather than turn to them for sake of time, we'll just kind of go through that. In 1 Chronicles chapter 6, at verse 31, you're going to find that it talks about David appointed this group of people. And there are a number of names, and they were going to be seeing to the worship that would be taking place at the temple, or in Jerusalem. I shouldn't say the temple, not initially, but at the in Jerusalem when the ark was brought there. So we know that it was there, and so was the tabernacle. The elements of the tabernacle were there in Jerusalem before a permanent structure, the temple, was built during Solomon's time. So in verse 39, you hear him mentioned, actually it's verse 38, his brother, and then Asaph is mentioned as being the brother of the man that's mentioned in verse 38. But Asaph is first mentioned there. So then you go forward to chapter 25 of 1 Chronicles, and you'll find that there are these people that were the descendants. They're referred to as the sons of Asaph that are mentioned in the first verse of chapter 25. So this is a common thing, whether it's the Kohathites that are mentioned in chapter 6, the Korah, the sons of Korah, we hear them mentioned as well. But in this case, it could be the sons of Asaph, could even be people who just belong to, some would think, that there were a line of people that had really kind of maybe not direct descendants, but of the line of poets and musicians and whatnot that came through Asaph, people that he had instructed and people that were kind of discipled, if you will, by him. That might be a stretch. I think it's pretty much easy from, like it is with many of the other family names, it would come down through the generations, and even the generations of people would be known as the sons of, or attribute directly as though they are that same person. So when we read here that it's a psalm of Asaph and it's put to music, the things that are described in this first one, chapter 74 or Psalm 74, clearly never happened during David's time, certainly not during Asaph's time, but his descendants, absolutely. So what you look at here is a time of just real devastation in the nation, and to the point where even the Jerusalem itself has been destroyed, the temple has been wiped out, and so clearly there's a temple that is implied in this as well. So clearly never during David's time, never during Asaph's time, but his descendants, it would have been during their time. When Jeremiah is the prophet, and some of the other minor prophets as well, are during that, at the time up to the captivity. And then when you think of Ezekiel and Daniel, it's during that time of captivity, ultimately being brought back during the times of Ezra and Nehemiah. So let's go ahead and turn to Psalm 74, and let's start there. Let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you so much for our time that we can spend in your word. We would pray, God, that you would give us understanding hearts and minds, and our ears would be open and attentive, that not only are we reading the history, but what things can we glean from it that are applicable to our day? And how is it that you deal with your people through the ages and with the world through the ages as well? So we would ask that you would help us in our understanding of why this should be important. This bit of history, what is the relevance of it to us today? So we give to you all thanks, and we pray that we would grow in our understanding of you and how you do the things that you do, and that you are always good and right in what you do. We give you all thanks and praise in Jesus' name. All right, so Psalm 74, you can see kind of like from the very beginning of it, it's pretty obvious that there's a very devastating thing that happened. So let me just put it up front first. Let's just assume, because it would fit really everything that we're going to read here, let's assume that this is written after the time of the captivity. Some would kind of put it later into that 70-year period of their exile away from Jerusalem. If you're not familiar with the history of it, this is something that God told them that would happen to them if they abandoned him and started to seek after other gods. So that's told at the dedication of the temple. You can read that in 2 Chronicles 7. God answers the prayer of Solomon. We looked at this, I think, a couple of weeks ago. So with that being said, we know that what ends up happening to the nation goes into a place of just really dark idolatry. By this time, Israel in the north is long since gone for all the same reasons. That their kings, one after another, were rebellious against God, didn't care for the things of God, were not godly men, and the nation reflected that. They fell into idolatry from the very beginning. In the south, it was a little bit of a different story, but inevitably, as is kind of man's way of doing things, in the generations, it really degraded even in the south. And it got to the point where God even judged them. So much so, interestingly enough, one of David's sons, as it comes down through David to Solomon to Rehoboam, when the nation first split in two, down the line from Rehoboam, you get a man named Jehoiakim, and or Jehoiachin, and so depending on where you're reading, it's the same guy. And what he ends up doing is gets into such evil and wickedness that God ends up cursing his line. He had children, he had sons, but God says, let him be seen as childless. And that's a way of just announcing judgment, that God will not recognize his line. And so that becomes a real problem because he's a descendant of David. And we know that the Messiah must come through Judah and it must come through David. But again, the importance of that is that God has another way in this, that Jesus comes through the line of Mary, who comes through the line of Nathan and not Solomon. So just really important that we understand that little bit of history. If I went through that too fast, then send me an email, oldpaththeology.net, and I'll be happy to go through the verses that talk about that. But for where we are right now, this is a time that God is going to judge as he said that he would. And so historically, what ends up happening is that the Babylonians come. There are 3 separate sieges that happen over a 19-year period. And finally, Jerusalem falls to the hands of Nebuchadnezzar and the nation, or the people of Babylon. And so much of the nation is taken away captive, and they're taken away to Babylon, and they're just put in servitude. It's going to be 70 years. God proclaimed that would be the case. You can read that through Jeremiah. We get that at the last couple of verses of the book of 2 Chronicles, that the reason for their 70 years, Jeremiah is the one who identifies the 70 years. But in that interval of time, the Persians come onto the scene, and they become the world power that we would understand. And so as we read this, that seems to be all the kind of backstory and history and where this is being written, because it would make sense that it's either at the front end of this captivity or at the back end of it, because they're either just in shock that it's taken place, or that it's to the end of it and they're wondering when it will come to pass that this will be over with. So Psalm 74, it begins in verse 1 like this: "O God, why have you cast us off forever?" Now, again, some of this stuff is said in almost the hyperbolic way, because they know that God's promises were forever. But there are also those times that we know that something is sure, but it sure seems like it's never going to take place, right? So they ask, why have you cut us off forever? Why does it seem as though there's no end to this? And yet, the interesting thing, since this seems to be in the history of Israel from David's time on, and from Asaph's time on, The first real big event that this could be, where Jerusalem is mentioned, really has to be that captivity of the Babylonians into the Persians. That's really the only place where this fits. And if they're going to be honest, they would also know that there's going to be a reason, or the reason why it's going to be 70 years. And they know the length of the time, most importantly, because of the writings of Jeremiah. So he warned them that 70 years was going to be the case. And you can get that in chapters 29 and 30 of Jeremiah. And he kind of goes through and explains God regathering not only Judah, but also Israel future. That's when there's a perfect fulfillment of that promise. So he says, "Oh God, why have you cast us off forever? Why does your anger smoke against the sheep of your pasture?" Or it ascends up like smoke. It's just that devastation. It's use a lot of imagery and poetic kind of imagery here. It's it's pretty clear he's talking about, they know that something really horrible's happened, but if you're trying to capture the imagery of it, smoke ascending up is from ruin, not like the smoke that would ascend up from sacrifices, which God says is a savory thing. In this case, it's the destruction and the smoke of that destruction that goes up. So it says, "Remember your congregation which you have purchased of old, the tribe of your inheritance which you have redeemed." And tribe there just simply is a way of looking at not one particular tribe, but the whole of the nation. All of the tribes gathered together. It's the nation, it's the people. And so tribe is mentioned of people in the whole, as far as his people are concerned. So remember your congregation which you purchased of old, which is what a great, when you start to think about that in the New Testament sense, the idea of having the life of the person purchased. Now, we understand that to Israel, they would see exactly that God had purchased them, and he uses that kind of language and speaks about such things, that they were ones that he had purchased and that there was a great price for it. We also know from, again, the New Testament, because there's a perfect fulfillment in that what it takes to reconcile man from the beginning, those who walked with God by faith, though they never had a perfect sacrifice made until Jesus was the one who ultimately purchased both Jew and Gentile alike. And so all would be able to look to him as their Redeemer, the one who has paid the purchase price of their ransom. So it says in verse 2, "Remember your congregation which you purchased of old, the tribe of your inheritance which you have redeemed, this Mount Zion where you have dwelt." So that already tells us, when it's starting to be mentioned as Mount Zion, then we know kind of the area that we're talking about for sure. Mount Zion's mentioned all the way back in David's time, but never in a way of desolation. So it says, verse 3, "Lift up your feet to the perpetual desolations. The enemy has damaged everything in the sanctuary." So the lifting up your feet means, would you make haste to come to us? And so walk and come to see it. Hasten yourself to come and see. And so lift up your feet to the perpetual desolations. The enemy has damaged everything in the sanctuary, which is what they see when they come back under Nehemiah. So the walls are broken down. That's the report that he gets, and he's in now Persia at the time when this all happens, or under the control of the Persians, and then he is sent back. So read the book of Nehemiah, and you see exactly how this all works, and who was in charge, Artaxerxes at the time. And so they come back to the devastation, and by this time Zerubbabel has rebuilt the temple to some extent, and it's just nothing compared to what it should have been. But it was Nehemiah's task to undo the damage that was done in the breaking down of the city walls. And so when you think about it, even with Zerubbabel, he's 70 years after the event, and Nehemiah is probably just a little short of a generation down the road. So if you just throw round figures out, 100 years in excess of that, from the time that they were first destroyed until Nehemiah comes back and sees the walls for himself and begins that job of rebuilding it. And then ultimately Ezra comes in and they begin what is really the right and honorable, acceptable sacrifice to God. And there is now the priesthood that starts again and all of that. So he goes on to say, "Now lift up your feet to this perpetual desolation, and the enemy has damaged everything in the sanctuary. Your enemies roar in the midst of your meeting place. They set up their banners for signs, and they seem like men who lift up axes against thick trees. So once again, this goes to the extent of the plunder of it and how destroyed and wiped out it is. So once again, if it would be the timing of this, this would have been what it would have looked like to them in the early days. It would have also been what it would have looked like, after they've had a chance to look at everything after the massive destruction of it. And if, again, you put it to the time before Zerubbabel comes back, and we don't know. It just doesn't give us enough detail. But this is what it would have looked like, say, if Zerubbabel had come back and looked at it at the end of that 70 years when God began to bring them back. By the time that Nehemiah sees it, it could still kind of be the same way, but the temple, again, at least it was back up and it was functioning, though they had not even begun to do the kind of restoration that should have been done. That's one of the things you read from Nehemiah. He couldn't believe how they had fallen down on this. They'd had all this time, decades, to be working on it from the time that Zerubbabel got there until Nehemiah shows up, and everybody just gone on with their lives, and they're living in a broken down place, and Nehemiah is incensed by it. It's really a fascinating history if you're not that familiar with it. So he says in verse 5, they seem like men who lift up axes among thick trees, and now they break down its carved work all at once with axes and hammers. They have set fire to your sanctuary, and they have defiled the dwelling place of your name to the ground. They said in their hearts, let us destroy them altogether, and they have burned up the meeting places of God in the land. Now, if this was said as a way of complaint, then God's reply simply could have been, this is everything that I said would happen if you would rebel against me, and I would not protect you any longer. If you're going to abandon and walk away from me, I'm not going to chase you down and make you do it, but this is what will become of you. So he had warned them about that from Solomon's time forward, and the prophets were sent to the nations, not only to Judah, but also to Israel, and they all rejected it, and this is the result of it. So this is being written, if we take this that it's just a statement of fact, then God doesn't have to reply in this. If this was said as an indictment, why are you allowing this to happen, and what have we done? Then clearly God could have said, well, you should have expected this. And I think it's an important thing also, if we want to make an application to this, we want to be really careful. The things that we do, there can be consequences to our actions. Can we be forgiven? Absolutely. And is God able to restore and make things right? Absolutely. And I don't think any one of us would ever look at our lives and say, I'm faultless. There's no way any accusation could be made against me. But I don't care, from the least to the greatest. Anyone who does fail ultimately needs to say, I may fail, but that's not God's fault. He's not the one who failed. I'm the one who failed. So we never want to get it to the place where we'd say, my actions are not a reflection on his unfaithfulness. They're a reflection on mine. He remains ever vigilant. He's ever right, and he's ever good. So any failure that there is not to be reflected on him. It's us. So he's not the problem. We're the problem. It's always that way. Humanity's that way. So again, they wouldn't be able to bring an accusation against God as though somehow he failed. In fact, if anything, he made precisely good on what he said would take place if they did what they did. The blame is all one-sided in this case. The only thing that you can say that was faithful is that God said, I would do this if you did that, and he did exactly what he said he was going to do. So the error is not with him. Verse 9, we do not see our signs. There is no longer any prophet, nor is there anyone among us who knows how long. And it's just a statement of fact. We're not seeing God's hand in this. And again, that should be expected. The nation, if it's going to rebel against him, don't expect him to show up and start doing things as though it's business as usual, or the way that things have always been. So this is, again, it's not a complaint as much as it is a statement of fact. We don't see our signs, and there's no longer any prophet. And that's prophet, P-H-E-T, not F-I-T, not like money. It's prophet. Nobody who's telling us these things, nor is there anyone among us who can say, how long? Oh God, how long will the adversary reproach? Will the enemy blaspheme your name forever? simple answer to that question, depending on where they are in the situation. Well, if all that you had to do from the time of them being taken away, start to look at 70 years. And once you hit 70 years, you know God's going to start bringing them back. However he was going to do it, we know historically, looking back on it, it happened during the Persian Cyrus, who sends back Zerubbabel, underwrites the whole thing, pays them to, pays for the sending them back. Interesting how that all works. It's a fascinating study if you look through it. So it says, how long, O God, will our adversary reproach? How long will they be able to make the case that God's people are under the thumb? Well, it's a simple answer. It will take at minimum 70 years from the beginning of it. And how long it takes to get it right, it really depends on the people and their perseverance and their zeal to do it. Remember, again, if you go back and read Nehemiah, once he finally gets there, his whole thing is, what have you guys been doing for decades? How is this not finished yet? The wall should be repaired. The temple should be working. It should be everything the way that it's supposed to be. And his just unbelief at the situation is, this is how we got into this situation in the first place, and now you guys are going right back to the same thing. He's an interesting character to read about. So it says in verse 11, why do you withdraw your hand, even your right hand, the one of power? Take it out of your bosom and destroy them, for God is my king from old, and working salvation in the midst of the earth. So the writer here makes a couple of statements here. The first one is, my God is the king from king of old, working salvation in the midst of the people, which is a statement of fact. So he's asking, God, would you come back and begin the situation of avenging? And then his point is, because you're the God who's always done those things. And I love the idea of confidence in that. And at the same time, just trying to figure it all out. So again, I think every one of us has been in a place where we're just looking at circumstances of things and wondering, how did it get like this? And when will this whole thing be over? But this I know, that at the end of the day, with all the things I can't quite figure out, God is faithful. He will never fail. He's the one who is of old always been my God. He's always been the one who has done what he's supposed to do. And I know it sometimes to us feels like, what a dilemma. How is it that things can be such a mess and yet God is ultimately faithful? And interestingly enough, in this case here, God would be able to say, well, yeah, I am, and I've done all those things in the past, but all of what you see and all the wreckage and the carnage that has taken place is because man rebelled. Not because God failed, man failed. So in verse 13, you divided the sea by your strength, and you broke the heads of the sea serpents in the waters. You broke the heads of Leviathan in pieces, and you gave him as food to the people inhabiting the wilderness. This sounds very much like Job, not just because of Leviathan, but ultimately the recognition as you get towards the latter part of that book of God's greatness, and he's the one to whom everything of the creation answers, whether they're the natural world, whether it's the animals, whatever it may be, it all answers to him. And so this is where you kind of see, after all of the things that are seen as kind of complaints or statements of fact for the mess that things are, here he's able to kind of step back from it all and speak about, how things have gotten better. They really recognizing who God is and that these things should be working themselves out. So he says, verse 17, you broke open the fountain and the flood, and you dried up mighty rivers. The day is yours, the night is yours also. And you have prepared the light and the sun. You have set all borders of the earth, and you have made summer and winter. So again, very reminiscent of what you see at the latter parts of the book of Job. But one thing here, it's also important to recognize. This is a reiteration and a claiming of the narrative that we get in Genesis 6 through 8 of the flood. Because it mentions you're the one who opened the deep in the flood. And so that idea that the picture that's given to us is it's more than just rain, but water kind of came forth out of the ground, and the earth was split into pieces. The calamity of the flood is more than just a deluge of water. If you go back and read it, it's much more than that. So here there's alluding back to it of an actual event and not some metaphor like people want to try to explain it away. Sadly enough, people in the church will look at the book of Genesis, especially 7 and 8 of the flood, and say it's metaphor and that it's allegory for something or another. But every time that it's ever spoken of by another writer, Old or New Testament, it's being spoken of as an actual event, something that took place. And so, if this is the first time you're hearing me talk about this, I think it's very, very important for us as believers in what the Word has to say, that if God speaks about something in a very specific way and literally, then we are to also understand it in the literal sense. And if we do so, we'll be able to find the evidence for it. So when God says that it was a literal flood and for the reasons that he did, once again, does God have to make it a metaphor because the earth was filled with violence and it was wicked? Man's thoughts were just continually evil. That was a statement of fact. So why have somehow a judgment of the earth, which is what it called for? If God said he judged the world by water, the allegory makes no sense if you're looking at some of the other parts of this are absolutely literal. The things that had taken place and what man was doing and that God was going to judge it. And if it's going to be a worldwide judgment, he did it somehow, even in the allegory. So, I mean, the whole thing of trying to explain things away, God just tells you what he did. He's not looking to win an argument. He's just telling you what happened because he was there. So, again, the people that doubt God's word for whatever reason, because it offends their sensibilities or because they bought into the lie presented to them by evolution. So it says, verse 16, the day is yours, the night is yours also. You have prepared the light and the sun. You have set all the borders of the earth, and you have made summer and winter. Remember this, that the enemy has reproached, O Lord, and that the foolish people has blasphemed your name. That's speaking about whoever these adversaries are. And again, if it's the Babylonians, we know from Nehemiah's time, it's even the people who were there at the time of the rebuilding. There were a lot of adversaries at the time. And so is this speaking purely about the conquerors or the people who were still in opposition even as they began the rebuilding? Any of it would work. So it says, oh, do not deliver the life of your turtle dove to the wild beasts. And so a turtle dove is just something that's completely defenseless. And so the writer here puts Israel and Judah in particular as those who are as doves, they can't defend themselves. So they're looking to him, deliver the life. And do not forget the life of your poor forever. Again, the people that were poor as a result of coming back and really having nothing. So it says, verse 20, have respect for to the covenant, for the dark places of the earth are full of the haunts of cruelty. And so the covenant was made to the people. And so the request is don't lose sight of that, even though there is all of this calamity and the horrors that have taken place. And of course, God would never forget that covenant. Remember the covenant that God made with Abraham, and it's an important thing considering the world in which we live now because of all the intrigues and things that are happening in Gaza and the kind of threats that have been made against Israel. The idea that God made a covenant with them that is everlasting and it's enduring. Genesis 15 to 17 makes that abundantly clear and painfully clear. If anybody wants to look, there's just no real debate to this anymore. Unfortunately, people try to, or they're ignorant of what the scriptures have to say about these things. But here it is definitely a forever matter. So it says, and do not let the oppressed return ashamed. And so as they come back from that captivity, let them not be ashamed, but everything that you had promised, even in their restoration, may it be so. So he says, let the poor and needy praise your name. Arise, O God, plead your own cause, and remember how the foolish man reproaches you daily. And do not forget the voice of your enemies, the tumult of the tumult of those who rise up against you increases continually. And so these last two verses are just a way of saying there are those who speak against you, and it's, if we look at this as being one of those things where the person hearing this is so troubled by the rhetoric of those and the arrogance of saying that we've defeated God's people, this is a way of I believe what he's getting across is pretty obvious by the language, but it's the intent behind it. And I think that there are those times when we could look at this and say, well, the ulterior motive here is that he wants for God to go after the enemy so that they can have things put back the way that they were. David was, I think, very, very good at doing this. His concern was that the enemies of God would reproach him if these things continued on. So the request here is not for the benefit of the people, but rather that God would not fall into a place of bad reputation as a result of all of this continuing. And that seems to be more the case of what we're looking at here. So from Psalm 74 to Psalm 75, again, we'll be able to try to piece together what fits the language the best through their history, since we're not given those details. Sometimes we are in the Psalms. It'll tell us about this as a particular thing that had taken place, and it's attributed to a particular event. This, like the last one, there are those times that it fits very well some particular history, but you can't always tell. So in Psalm 75, verse 1, it says, "We give thanks to you, O God, we give thanks, for your wondrous works declare that your name is near." And so just a straightforward way, a psalm, or a song of gratitude and thanks. Now, at verse 2, and starting at verse 2, we get what clearly is a change of speaker here. Some believe that the change of speaker going to God, everybody agrees it's God who says these things. Clearly, he's the only one who could say this. But does it continue all the way through to the end of the chapter? Some make that case. It would appear as though it kind of jumps between. The first words here, as it says right here in the ultimate triumph of righteousness to the chief musician set to "Do Not Destroy," a song that would be known, is a psalm of Asaph. So whoever it is of his line, from Asaph down, the writer of this then ends up saying this in the way of just like praise and gratefulness and thanksgiving. "We give thanks to you, God, we give thanks, for your wondrous works declare that your name is near." And then God interjects in verse 2. It says, "When I choose the proper time, I will judge uprightly." Asaph would never make such a statement. God is the one who can judge, and God alone. So he says he does this in the upright sense, that there is nothing unjust or unrighteous about his judgments. When he makes a judgment, it's always right and it's upright. So it says, "The earth and all of its inhabitants are dissolved. I set up its pillars firmly." Once again, something that God and God alone can say. That the whole of the creation and even the created itself are all subject. He's the one who has put them there. So he's the only one who is equipped to actually, empowered, I should say, has the power to judge, but he's also the only one who knows how to do so righteously. So then verse 4, "I said to the boastful." So this could be Asaph, or it could be God continuing speaking, but I'm kind of more of the opinion that it would fit better that it would be Asaph or one of his sons, whoever's writing this, would be the ones who skip back from after God has spoken to saying the same things. Either one works. If somebody was to try to make the case that starting at verse 2 through the end of this, it's all God speaking, and others that would believe that it's back and forth between God and Asaph, I don't have a problem with either one. I tend to believe it's Asaph or his descendants. So they said, this person says, "I said to the boastful, do not be or deal boastfully, and to the wicked, do not lift up the horn," which is the horn in this case. There's an imagery to it, and some would look at that if they have that view that it's imagery of the animal that would refuse to be bound or have a yoke put upon it. So the idea of raising up the head being that resistance, and that's really kind of however you want to do it. It's the idea of somebody taking matters into their own hands and being resistant to what God is doing. If that's the case, which I believe that it is, that would be the boastful people that are being spoken of here. In boastful, there's an arrogance and a self-assurance. And here they're being told to the wicked, "Do not lift up the horn, and do not lift up the horn on high. Do not speak with a stiff neck." So yeah, you get all the imagery of this. God wants to bring them to the place where they are guided. And yeah, if we want to use the imagery, putting a yoke around them. These are the things that you're supposed to do, but they're resistant. Well, God will not be resisted. So it says in verse 6, for exaltation comes neither from the east, nor from the west, nor from the south, but God is judge. Now he is the one who puts down the one and then exalts the other. And again, I love the picture. The imagery of this is just great, because once again, this is something that makes the arrogant just bristle. The idea that you're telling me that I have to be answerable to some deity that I cannot see. Okay, well, again, you have no other better explanation for how you got here in the first place. But there are so many evidences, if you will, that there is a creator. And once we can get beyond the idea that there's a creator, did that creator ever communicate anything? Because if he did, then that opens up this entire dialogue. What are we responsible for? Has he made himself known? All of those kind of questions come into play. In this case, yeah, there is one who has created us. The complexity of the human body and DNA and how that is made, how things are actually made, the information that's found in DNA, all those kind of things, doesn't happen randomly. People can try to tell themselves that it does, but that's fine. They can be wrong. The problem is, by the time that they realize that they're wrong, it's too late. But in this case here, God's the one who made the things that he does, and in the way that he has. And so it says, he's the one who raises up and he's the one who puts down. There's not a problem with the believer being able to believe that. It's only those who have that self-assurance that I'm in control of all these things. Well, you're exalting yourself. And ultimately, God doesn't allow for people to self-exalt. He's the one who brings them up and brings them down, raises them up. It says now, verse 8, for in the hand of the Lord is a cup, and the wine is red. And so not exactly that it's the color, and the red looks to be, you can find other places where the same Hebrew word is used, and it's used more in the way of foaming. And so there's a churning and a churning of it, and that foams it up. And so why they've chosen to translate this as red, foams probably is the better way of looking at it. And really, it's a small matter in relation to the whole. The big part of this is that in God's hand is a cup. And so often we hear, using Jesus' own words, if this cup can pass from me, there's something that is about to take place, and it's put forward as a task. There's something that's coming it's in a cup, and it's ultimately the wrath that's going to be poured out on him is what is going to be his life. But think about the bowl judgments as well. There are bowls that are represented, and there are judgments that are about to be poured out. It's all the same imagery. So the imagery is this, that there is in the hand of the Lord this cup, and the wine is red. It is fully mixed, and he pours it out. Nobody pours it out themselves. It's he who is pouring out. In this case, it's a judgment. It is fully mixed, and he pours it out. Surely its dregs shall all the wicked of the earth drain and drink down. So when you get to the dregs, that's the stuff that's at the bottom. And so if it's in this case, as he says, it's wine, in the bottom is all the solids that are part of it in the fermentation. They go to the bottom. Nobody ever drinks those things. Or it's like the coffee grounds that go to the bottom. If you're drinking the kind of coffee that's made with grounds and it's not filtered out, you don't take that last sip, because that's where all the dregs are. It's where all the pieces are. In this case, that's just a way of saying what God's going to pour out is going to be poured out in its entirety. There will be nothing that will be left of it. So surely the dregs shall all the wicked of the earth drain and drink down, but I will declare forever, I will sing praises to the God of Jacob, and all the horns of the wicked I will also cut off, but the horns of the righteous shall be exalted. So here would be a place where God comes back in and interjects that he's ultimately the one who will do these things. So the idea that God is going to be ultimately the judge, and there's that neat little back and forth that is there in verse 9. After he's talking about the dregs and the full wrath of God will be ultimately poured out, the writer here is able to say, but I will declare forever, and I will sing praises to the God of Jacob. So clearly that's the writer showing himself in opposition to those people. They're going to do what they are going to do. They'll be judged for it. I, on the other hand, will be this. And then if it goes back to God making the final statement, all the horns of the wicked I will cut off, because it's ultimately God who does that. So it seems pretty clear he's the one speaking. But the horns of the righteous shall be exalted. So that thing about what makes them who they are, those people, God will be the one who exalts them or lifts them up, just as we've read at verse 7. Same thing. It's God who raises up and puts down. He's the one who exalts. It's not man. So that's ultimately verses 6 and 7. Psalm 76, as we complete the Psalms that we're looking at here. In Psalm 76, it says, in Judah, God is known, and his name is great in Israel. In Salem also is his tabernacle, and his dwelling place is in Zion. There he broke the arrows of the bow, the shield, and the sword of battle. Now, it's an interesting, once again, when did this take place? Because it sure seems as though it's said retrospectively on when God has done the things he's done. The mention of Israel has made it one of those things of, okay, is that speaking of that God is the one who is over Israel, not as the divided kingdom? Because there's an episode in something that happened in the divided kingdom when a nation had come up against Jerusalem but had them be broken back. Now, future to our times, that will happen once again. The nations are going to come against Jerusalem one more time. Zechariah speaks about that, and God will once again come to their assistance and break the backs of those who are looking to destroy them. He did this also with Sennacherib, the Assyrian. This is the same Sennacherib. It's the same nation who had, kind of worked his way all the way through the northern parts and really even to the south of Jerusalem. Assyria was just wiping everybody out. So you can read about this in Isaiah, and this is the time when King Hezekiah was the king, and it's also found in the Chronicles, the parallel chapters that are there. But it really was this, that the Assyrians had made it all the way to Jerusalem, and their general, known as the Rebshakeh, was kind of taunting. And pretty much it's like, here's the nations, here's the kings. These guys, they all said that they'd be able to stand against us. They all trusted in their gods. And where are they now? We've destroyed all of them. Don't let. And the actual taunt went directly to the people. And they said, don't listen to Hezekiah. Don't listen to Isaiah. Your God can't save you any more than these other gods saved you. And we all know how that worked out. So that was where Assyria was turned back in a night. And so if that's the case here, then of course God is seen as the God of Israel. Israel as just the people. Whenever we see, let's remember this, I think I may have mentioned this last week. Whenever we see Israel or the children of Israel, let's remember Jacob or the children of Jacob. It was God who changed Jacob's name to Israel in that time when he wrestled with what would have been, before we knew him as Jesus, it would have been the Son coming down as the angel of the Lord. And he has this wrestling time with Jacob. And why do we know that it was Jesus? Well, because ultimately Jacob worships him, and no angel would allow worship to come to him. So the angel doesn't correct him, and the worship is accepted, and God does not intervene of an angel accepting worship. So there's something very different about this angel. And so the only one who it could be would be Jesus coming in the form of an angel messenger. And nobody would have known him as Jesus the Son. We know him that way because of his incarnation, becoming flesh and dwelling among us. So anyway, from that time on, this man Jacob, who meant the supplanter or the heel catcher, that was something given to him at birth because of what happened during the birth process. And then later, this angel tells him that his name has been changed. That means God prevails. So whenever Israel is used, sometimes it's speaking about the nation proper, the entirety of the nation, as we speak about it, let's say today. There was also a time when Israel was known as the northern tribes and Judah was the southern tribes. So when you read this, just think Israel as the nation, and that God traditionally has been the God of Israel. The fact that at the time, when it appears as though, looking at the historic timeline of this, really all that remained was Jerusalem and Judah, I should say, where Jerusalem was found. So when you get to the part of, if this is speaking about the Assyrians being conquered, right outside the gates of Jerusalem. That was done during the time of Hezekiah, the king of Judah, and during the time of Isaiah the prophet. And by that time, the northern tribes had already been overcome, and really Assyria, for the most part, was pretty much controlling almost the major cities of Judah as well, and had got all the way to Jerusalem. Was going to complete the job until this happened. So, with that bit of history, which I absolutely love, in verse 4 it says, "You are more glorious and excellent than the mountains of prey." Once again, probably used as more of a metaphor, looking towards these people. In this case, it would be Assyria and those people who are like these birds of prey. You can find that this is kind of similar imagery that you get in Isaiah about the Assyrians and their mountains, and then the idea that the birds of prey take what they get and they store it away. In the book of Nahum, that's there as well. So probably that same kind of imagery, looking more at Assyria as, putting them in this poetic language, but it's speaking of them. So it says, "They have sunk into their sleep, and none of their mighty men have found the use of their hands. At your rebuke, O God of Jacob, both the chariot and the horse were cast into a deep sleep." And whether that's trying to sound almost as though it's a complete, this is what took place, if what we know is that when Sennacherib sent his armies there, and Sennacherib was ended up getting turned back and was put to death in his own country, the Assyrian army had assembled all around Jerusalem. They were ready to siege it, and that was the time. If you're not familiar with the story, it's worth going and looking at. But both Isaiah and Hezekiah come before the Lord, and the terms, if you will, of their surrender were put into writing, and that was all put out in front of God. They take it into the temple, they lay it out, and they say, "God, here's what they say." And really, if you think about it, with the Assyrians, they had no reason to think anything would be different than all of their other conquests. The difference was they were finally coming up against a people who believed in a God who was alive and able. And I believe that it's absolutely the intercession of both Isaiah and Hezekiah that moved God's hand to do what they did. Or what he did, rather. So they lay the whole thing out. Look at what they've said against you, God. And it's really one of those things that their indictment was, sure, it's against the people. They've done the things that they've done. But the indictment really went to the heart of trying to mock the God of heaven. And so they asked us in that way, Isaiah, Hezekiah, "God, would you do something, because look at what they say of you." And if they really care for his name, clearly Isaiah did, and Hezekiah with his failures would also, I think we would all want to be able to say the same way. I'm concerned most, if I'm Isaiah or Hezekiah, don't let what they say and their arrogance be able to make you look in any way weak on behalf of your people. And there was a sincerity to it, obviously. If they weren't sincere, I don't know that God answers that prayer. Clearly, he did have to preserve so much of the nation, but he did let it ultimately go into exile later. He was going to ultimately do what he was going to do, whether they were in the land or not. But suffice to say, we know from the history of it, as they woke up the following morning and look over the walls, there is the army of the Assyrians. 185,000 of them died in their sleep. So what we just read, is that really kind of alluding to that you've caused this sleep to fall upon them. In that case, they weren't just sleeping in a prolonged way. They were dead. A single angel did it all in a night. So the idea, now if you're the people living inside the walls, you must look at that and go, God is able to do miraculous. So let me go ahead and address the critic. If we have somebody here thinking, it wasn't really 185,000, it's something else, it's just metaphor, it's whatever. Somehow you're going to try to explain it away. And you might say to me, you're telling me that a single angel could kill 185,000 men in their sleep? Do you want me to actually believe that? And let's remember that an angel would be sent by God to do a particular task. So it's God who would be empowering the angel to do it. And if God can speak the universe into existence, then he can empower an angel to do that, and I don't think it took overnight. I think it could have been instantaneous as far as that's concerned. However, it worked. Do I believe that 185,000 were wiped out in a night? Yeah, absolutely, I believe that. Why? Well, because the scripture says so. And there's no reason for him to say it the way that he does, because again, it's not allegory, it's not metaphor. That army needed to be defeated, and they were ready to go in, and there's nothing that Jerusalem could have done to fight against it. That 185,000 soldiers, you can't do it. And so if you've ever been to Israel and you try to look at the old city, 185,000 people wanting to get in and wanting to destroy you, that are military people and have marched through every place else that they've gone, that would not be a difficult task. So God comes to their aid, and in a miraculous sense. So at your rebuke, verse 6, O God of Jacob, both the chariot and the horse were cast into a deep sleep. You yourself are to be feared. You and who may stand in your presence when once you are angry? Just a self-answering question. Who could ever defy God? Nobody could. And I look at this and I just think, the day is going to come when he will come back to this earth, and he will be the King of Kings and Lord of Lords in the person of Jesus Christ. And who can withstand him at that point? And it just shows the difference between those who believe and those who don't. I don't fear him in this sense. I'm not coming back to be judged. In fact, anything that I could ever do was already paid for in his blood at Calvary. And no matter what amount of failure any of us ever come to, there's never a time that we're at a place where God cannot forgive. So I find great comfort in that, and all of us should as well. What he ended up doing, he did so that he could secure an eternal reward for us and not something that's temporal. And we should be able to walk with him looking forward to what comes later, but also remembering that he calls us to fellowship with him right here and right now. It's just wonderful. So it goes on. In verse 8 it says, you caused judgment to be heard from heaven, and the earth feared and was still. And so if that's alluding to or picturing back what took place that morning, again, if you're the king and you're Isaiah, you're looking to God and you're saying, God, thank you for hearing our prayer. If you're the people looking over the wall, you're just saying, God has shown himself mighty on our behalf. If you're anyone that's left of the Assyrians, you're looking at that and saying, what has happened? This was, there was no fight that took place at night. And why is it only that these mighty men, these soldiers, these ones who were going to go to war, why are they the only ones dead? So the fear that there would be, and would it make the earth still, and everybody who could see it was just going to be there in a place of absolute awe and disbelief. So in verse 9, when God arose to judgment to deliver the oppressed of the earth, surely the wrath of man shall praise you. With the remainder of wrath you shall gird yourself. It's an interesting thing. Surely the wrath of man will praise you. That's not going to be voluntary. The people who hate God are going to ultimately have to come to the place of praise, not in the sense that they want to, but they're going to have to, as Paul talks about in Philippians, that at the name of Jesus, every knee bows, every tongue confesses, whether they're under the earth, on the earth, wherever they may be, throughout all of eternity, and throughout all of man's history, ultimately they will come and bow the knee before him. Some reluctantly, unwilling to do so, but they will be forced to do so. Others of us have already done that in our lives, and it's really kind of a daily thing. And so if he were here, of course, bowing before him, he's majesty, he's the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. It's his rightful place, and yet I always temper that by John 15, where it says, but he calls us friends. Mind-blowing. Mind-blowing. Surely the wrath of man shall praise you. Those people who are wrathful towards you are going to have to ultimately admit that you are indeed Lord. With the remainder of, you could say, their wrath, whatever's left of the wrath of man, with it you will gird yourself. So after you've pronounced judgment, even the wrath and anger of man will be something that you would adorn yourself with, and in the way of conquering. You've conquered the wrath of man. In your own wrath you have prevailed. And it was never even going to be a question who would prevail. So at the end of it, verse 11 and 12, it's a way of the writer saying, here's what God has done. Here's what he will continue to do of those who would oppose him. And then this is said as a reassuring kind of a close to this. But for those who trust you, they would be able to say this: make vows to the Lord your God and pay them. When you say that you're going to do something, I will vow to do this before the Lord, make good on the vow. Let all who are around him, God, bring presents to him who ought to be feared. Yeah, presents, that the offerings of things to him. God, you are worthy of what I offer to you. Bring these things in the voluntary sense, and really also the way of thanksgiving and gratitude. He will cut off the spirit of the princes, and this is Nagid, is the princes. And so in this case, a prince would be a person that is in a place of great authority. And there's one that would be greater than he, and that would be he, speaking of he, God, is awesome to the kings of the earth. And the kings there is Melech. And that's you have your princes, you have your Nagid, but your Melech is above them all. So it's the king above the kings, or above the princes, above the rulers. And in this case, it says, even of those great men of the earth, they are just like all others. They will have to bow before the ultimate king. And again, how cool is this, that this is said during the time that the Psalms were written, and yet we look at it in hindsight and say, well, yeah, I look at Jesus, and it says of him in Revelation 19 that when he comes back to the earth, he will be known as the king above all kings and the Lord above all lords. So even the greatest and the mightiest of men, anyone who has ever existed, is mere mortal before him. He is great. And so he is the I am of from Exodus all the way through the book of Revelation. God is being able to say, I exist. I am the existent one, the I am. And no one else could ever make such a statement. So great stuff. We'll pick up at Psalm 77 next week. And if you have any questions on any of what we've gone over this time, please let me know. And look forward to sharing 77 and onward from there next week with you. Once again, the website is oldpaththeology.net, and there is an email that you can send through that, through the website, or you can just comment on the YouTube channel if that's how you're watching this. So we pick up at Psalm 77 next week.